name is Miles Morales. I'm the one and only Spider-Man.
Number 2, Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse. Well, here's an entry that from the very start of voting for the best stories of 2018 was a clear frontrunner and very nearly took the number 1 spot. In fact, while for the most part on both the best and worst of 2018 list and results as decided by our viewers, I agree with the general premise of most of these results, even if some of them weren't my personal choices or they wouldn't exactly go in my ordering. I fundamentally disagree with the results of this one. Spider-Verse should have won. And I'm not disappointed with our viewers or the results or anything like that. I understand, and we'll get into why the number 1 movie, when we know it's a movie and most of you should be able to figure out what it is by now, got into the number 1 spot, but I really do feel like this movie in particular deserves the win. And like I said, at first, this was going to be the winner. I thought Spider-Verse was going to take the number 1 spot in a landslide because that's what the results were turning up at first. Some people were just voting for Spider-Verse. No other stories on the best of worst, just Spider-Verse as being one of the best. That was their one and only vote, because this movie is damn near perfect. Produced by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, who are responsible for some of my all-time favorite movies at this point, and with 3 directors behind it that really know their stuff when it comes to animation, Into the Spider-Verse is one of the best comic book movies ever made, if not the best one to date. This movie raises the bar on every count. And while yes, it did eventually lose the number 1 spot to another movie, another big comic book movie that does deserve a lot of praise, I really think this one is special. And yes, as a Spider-Man fan, I'm going to be biased about that, and yes, I am going to be leaning towards this movie because it's a little bit more niche and kind of hits a little bit more home for comic book fans such as myself. But it's still just a special and wonderful movie, even if you're not a fan of Spider-Man or comic book stuff or anything like that. Purely from a filmmaking perspective, this is one of the best animated movies I've ever seen. Its unique use of art to facilitate storytelling by letting different characters rely on different animation styles is brilliant and works so effectively in telling a very complicated story in a very coherent and intelligent way. You really don't have to know anything about Miles Morales, alternate universes, Gwen Stacy, or even just the general history of Peter Parker to understand and appreciate the general premise of this film. And that's because somehow this movie is able to cover so much ground in so little time. We are introduced to Miles Morales, the general story behind him, a Peter Parker, the general story behind him, only for that character to die, and then us to be introduced to a new Peter Parker, and a bunch of other versions of Spider-Man, and then they all have to work together in telling a superhero origin story for Miles, as this character learns to come to terms with himself and defeat the big bad villain in the form of Kingpin. And though that sounds very complicated, this movie is very clear and intelligent in how it overlays this information and how it presents it to the viewer in a nice and fulfilling way that tells a proper and polished narrative. It is a beautiful movie in its animation style. When Miles finally comes to terms with himself as a character, that sequence is animated so beautifully and stunningly, it's a phenomenal treat to watch. Everything about this movie is great, and I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't yet. It's actually still in theaters in most cities, and it's worth your time. Straight up, if you somehow missed this one or passed on it because it's animation or something like that, you're missing out on one of the best comic book movies I've ever seen. One that I think raises the bar like no other superhero movie in 2018, and that's a challenging statement and achievement this far into the game, this deep in, and in a year that was pretty dang competitive in terms of awesome comic book movies. The voice casting is perfect, Miles is great, but I really have a soft spot for John Mulaney as Spider-Ham and Nick Cage as Spider-Man Noir, both of whom do a great job in their role and really work as both comedic relief but a fun addition to the movie. The movie is smart, very slowly introducing this alternate universe stuff to get any viewer kind of acquainted with the whole idea before really gradually starting to ramp things up. And in spite of all that, this is very much a superhero origin story. We're introduced to the new character, he gets his powers, he tries out his powers, he starts learning how to use them. We have the all is lost moment, the character learns to believe in himself and seemingly just starts to know what to do and is able to keep up with all the other Spider-Men, and then they work together to save the day, with Miles being a key part of that. That's a very traditional superhero story if you strip away all the alternate universe stuff. But that's okay, because we're introducing all this alternate universe stuff in this movie, so to have a basic storyline as sort of the main framework of this story, and to let all the fun aspects of it sort of fill in the background, we're left with a very entertaining and unique movie, in spite of the fact that it does pretty much what every other superhero origin movie story has done so far. Because it adds so much to that basic premise, and makes it so creative and different in that process, so visually interesting, but also from a story perspective, it keeps you engaged through the use of that classic comic book narration in Miles' brain. We are left with a near perfect take on the superhero origin story. And in a movie that's not only kind of a side project of Sony, this weird little animated thing they put together with some interesting directors and producers attached to it, but it manages to overtake all these other big budget movies that introduce new characters from 2018 and from long before that. It shows them up in a big way in spite of the fact that it didn't really have to. This movie could have been much more mediocre and people would have still loved it, but because it's so dang good, it particularly connected with people, and it very nearly took the top one spot on this list. And that's telling for this sort of movie, because this is not the highest blockbuster superhero movie of the year. In fact, it's not even close. Oh, it did great for a movie like that, and you compare it to something like Batman the Mask of Phantasm, or even more traditional animated movie releases that aren't the sort of all-ages Disney classics, this movie did really well. Very well, in fact, and I think we can all happily look forward to sequels to this thing, which this movie nicely sets up in some very fun ways. This movie is also unique in that it features the final Stan Lee cameo, and they kind of go out of their way to make it a really special one, which is good given what happened and the fact that the man's passed on now. This movie sort of feels like a love letter to Spider-Man and everything that's happened since then, with tons of great little cameos and references filled in throughout the entire storyline. Much like how they use Stan Lee to actually tell a point in this story that furthers the overall progression of the plot, they also use the cameos effectively to that same way. The Peter Parker of Miles Morales' universe, who passes away, is interestingly blonde-haired. That's an important little detail early on that's going to really help people wrap their heads around a different Peter Parker showing up later. But it's also a smart little detail if you know your Spider-Man history and a cute little reference to Ben Reilly. It's a little thing, but those little things go a long way in making this movie amazing. And it's genuinely funny too, with so many great jokes, right from the very beginning with Miles' dad shouting "I love you" on his first day of school. That was a really cute moment. Or my favorite line in the entire movie, when Miles' roommate Genki discovers all of the Spider-Men in his room, and Spider-Ham quietly asks, "Do animals talk in this universe? Because I don't want to freak this kid out." The animation style behind it's very cartoonish and steps away from the more realistic tones of animation that we might see in high-quality movies such as these, but they still get key things right, like facial expressions and making the eyes feel full of life. You look at something like Kingpin, and he's so big and ridiculous, he straight up lifts a car over his head at one point, without any real explanation for his apparent strength and mass. And it works, because it's a take of Kingpin that we know from the comics, the larger-than-life version of him that we pretty much saw in spades in the Ultimate Comics. In fact, we get a lot of those takes of villains in Miles' universe, and it's kind of cool seeing a female Octavius, and different versions of the Green Goblin and Scorpion. The whole thing just seems so cool and effortlessly sets itself apart from all the other Spider-Man storylines and universes and other movies and video games and even the comics. Take, for example, the origins and general story behind Miles' character. Given the nature of his origins in the comic books, it's a little more clunky and spaced out over a long period of time. It wasn't quite as planned out as Spider-Verse could be. And as such, the overall story of Miles' character feels a lot better and more polished in the movie than it does in the comic books. In fact, there's a lot in this movie that is kind of better and more interesting than the comic books. Take the Peter Parker that we spend the most amount of time with in this story. He's older than we've pretty much seen in almost any take on Spider-Man outside of a few alt-universe comic book stories. That's really cool, and we've never seen anything like this character in any superhero movie. He's been doing this for an astounding 22 years, so he's kind of both incredibly good at it, but also very lazy and doesn't really view it like he once does. He doesn't have the passion he once did, and the line of "with great power and great responsibility" just doesn't even faze him anymore. Things do matter to this character, and as we get into him a little more, he shows a lot of interesting shades, but it's a take on Peter Parker initially that we've never seen before. And I absolutely love the choice of making Jake Johnson the voice of this character, because he really nails that sort of sentiment that they wanted behind this older version of a hero that we all know. The movie is quite literally perfect. I don't have anything I would change or have done differently. It's smart that they didn't go full Spider-Verse in this first movie and focused on only a handful of characters to get us sort of used to it. And by combining different forms of animation, like the more realistic takes on Gwen, Peter, and Miles, and then the cartoonish look of Spider-Ham and the anime look of Penny Parker, we're left with this beautiful blend of a movie that has no peer. You straight up cannot be a Spider-Man fan anymore and not have seen this film. This film is now officially required viewing of any Spider-Man fan. I have no official capacity to declare as such, but I'm doing it just the same. Consider it essential. As essential as the Sam Raimi movies or some of the key comic book issues that we've seen over the years that define this character. I could probably sit here and talk about this movie for the entire run length of the actual film, if not longer. It's very cool, and each character begs more analysis and talking about them. That's how strong these characters are, that it's not just Miles' story that's done so well, it's also Gwen's and Peter's, and to a lesser extent some of the other secondary characters. And there's some key great moments between Miles and his dad throughout this movie that really moved me. Add into this some really intelligent stuff that gets into losing a Spider-Man and incorporating key moments of the actual Death of Spider-Man comic book, and we're left with a deeply sentimental movie that just is on a whole other level compared to anything we're seeing out of any studio. Yeah, it's amazing to me that Sony was able to produce a film that actually showed up the MCU, but it did. And if you notice I'm spending a little bit more time on this thing, it's because, to me, this is the winner. As much as I like the number one, as much as I like that entry, and I'm going to be talking about it unapologetically for why it's great and why it kind of deserves to be there, this is my personal favorite of the year. This is the thing out of all of anything associated with comic books that was produced in 2018 that spoke to me the most. But I don't accidentally bring up Sony at the end of this review, because while they are very much responsible for this brilliant, amazing, groundbreaking film, with animation techniques that people are going to be talking about for years, in spite of all of that, Sony also produced another comic book movie that managed to make its way to the number 2 worst stories of 2018 as decided by our viewers. So stay tuned for that. Shouldn't be too hard to figure out what it's going to be now. And thanks for watching. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description below. And finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.